Health doesn't happen in a vacuum, and neither should health care. In Designing for Impact and Outcomes, a conversation in behavior change, we explore the myriad forces that influence behavior, from social determinants to mental health, and how real-world data is being used to design and inform effective solutions that are not only valuable in the clinical setting, but are also appealing to use in daily life in order to create meaningful, healthy behaviors.
Thanks everyone for being here for our session on Designing for Impact and Outcomes, a conversation in behavior change, where we get the opportunity to bring together a multidisciplinary panel with backgrounds in behavioral science, behavioral design, and data science to talk about how those come together in our new world of digital health to deliver on our promise for digital health of improving outcomes for patients. I'm Kate Woolen, and I'm really excited for our outstanding panel today. And I'm going to give each of our panelists a second to introduce themselves and their background before we dive into our conversation. Just going around my screen, I'll start with you, Dustin.
Hey, thanks, Kate. Dustin D Tommaso. I lead the behavior change design discipline at MadPow, which is an experience design agency. My team and I are focused on exactly what this topic is about, on looking at how do we use behavioral science, design, data to develop digital products and services, change behaviors, deliver on health outcomes. Happy to be here.
Thanks. And Claire?
Hi, thanks, Kate. I'm Claire Pervis. I'm a clinical psychologist by background, and I am currently the Senior Director of Behavioral Science at Headspace, where my team focuses on helping to apply behavioral science in our product and content development to help us create more evidence-based and impactful experiences for our members, as well as overseeing our clinical research. So happy to talk about kind of how those worlds come together too.
Fantastic. And Gitu?
Hi, I'm Gitu, and I'm currently a strategic advisor for a couple of different data and health tech startups in New York in the Middle East. And most recently, I was the senior director of data science at Flatiron Health, which is a company that's trying to create real-world data sets to help accelerate patient care in oncology. And my background is mostly computer science and data science, and I'm super excited to be here to have this discussion.
Great. Well, I think one of the interesting things about the space that we're talking about today is that none of us went to school to do this. It's a relatively new area and one that has evolved quite a bit. And since each of you come to it from a different perspective, would love to talk a little bit about sort of coming out of your discipline of training, how you've bridged the divide between your discipline and the other disciplines that are in the room today, because I know for each of you, your work involves working with people who've trained in other areas, learning to speak other languages, and how those have come together for you. So, Gitu, as you came out of a data science background, how did you navigate that intersection with the clinical outcomes group in your movement into healthcare?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It's my funnest, I think, part of being part of the healthcare journey. Is that at Flatiron Health, we were really trying to bring together this set of people from, at the intersection of multiple disciplines. So people with a computer science background like myself, people with a clinical background, and even within clinical backgrounds, there's folks, with a more epidemiology biostatistics degree, folks with like a pure clinical sciences background, as well as nurse practitioners. And I've often referred to Flatiron as like the Tower of Babel. With a lot of people speaking past each other. Initially it was like a lot of us speaking past each other. And I think one of the things that really helped us was that we set ourselves up in these sort of interdisciplinary teams or product teams, which sort of had this one overarching goal, but all of us like sat together and were accountable for designing the product. And that really helped us start to learn and appreciate each and every, everyone's different background and discipline. And I think it took a lot of like learning and obviously coming to it with like, with a lot of respect for the other person's discipline, but also this curiosity of learning and contributing. And then I think the most important thing is, of course, that we're working in healthcare, where the mission and the outcome of what we are trying to impact is so important that sort of is having that mission is always very inspiring for all of us to sort of bridge that gap between disciplines.
Yeah. Claire, I'd love to hear you talk about coming out of a clinical background that is often oriented around a one-to-one relationship between the patient and the clinician, and now you're working in a space where you're serving huge numbers of people, and how you've navigated translating that clinical work as you collaborate with these other teams to have greater scale.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I mean, I really resonate with your story, Gitu, as far as cross-functional working and kind of finding these ways to bring many perspectives together. For me, as a clinical psychologist, there's certainly a strong focus on, providing one-to-one care and really tailoring. This has become sort of a buzzword in digital health, but in clinical psychology, this from an evidence-based practice perspective, it's always been about tailoring the evidence-based approach to an individual's specific presentation, what their needs are in this context, and learning to apply that evidence-based approach to this individual person and their context. But within clinical psychology, at least where I trained, there's also a really strong grounding in intervention science and really thinking about, in delivering those evidence-based one-to-one therapies, what are the mechanisms of change that hold across those interventions? And in our training, we're really taught to both think about, but also then experiment with and do our own research in designing and delivering interventions, which I think has the more immediate translation to what we do in digital health. Now, what I've found the most compelling in deciding to make that transition from a more academic, more traditional environment where we're doing intervention design and bring that into digital health is one that I got kind of lucky in that my lab as a graduate student was really in the early days of designing technology delivered interventions and thinking about using in those days, desktop computers on the internet, but using technology to scale access to evidence-based treatments. And so I had a bit of exposure to that space, but in a very academic environment. And in coming into industry, I think one thing I love is really getting to collaborate with these other disciplines, learn so much more about design, about data, about products, about commercial strategy. But from a pure intervention perspective, when we are designing for multitudes and we are, trying to create, in my case, app-based experiences that will help drive outcome across a large population, it really forces us to think about more person-centered, user-centered approaches to intervention design, which unfortunately still is not standard practice in more traditional evidence-based theory and practice development. It is still much more top-down, so to speak. We have a theory about how this works. We're going to test this theory in a study by designing these mechanisms of change or this intervention. And if people don't comply in the trial, well, then they weren't compliant with the treatment. But we still know that our theory holds, right? And that's still kind of the mentality in a more academic setting. But in a digital health environment, if someone's not using your product or not using your intervention, that's a problem for you as the intervention developer, right? And you need to actually put that person at the center of your process and say, what's not resonating here? In what way is this intervention not suited to your context? And what are the ways that I can bring those active ingredients that work that are going to connect with you and allow me to create conditions where you can engage in this? And that's it's subtle, but it's fundamentally a different way to think about designing interventions. And I think it will, thinking just from my mental health background, it will force our field to advance and I think to improve. And that I find really exciting.
Yeah. Dustin? you come at it from a design background primarily or initially. So how has that changed how you think about this?
Yeah, everything that Claire and Gitu said, but backwards. Yeah, so right, I got my start in designing learning technologies and coming at it from a research and design perspective that was theory driven, right? Self-determination theory, and looking at how motivation can be principles can be applied to technology and design, and does that have an effect on learning behavior and outcomes and things like that. When I got into health, I got into MadPal specifically to take that same approach, but apply it now into healthcare, which was new for me. Everything that you said, Claire, resonates, but our challenge was looking at coming the other direction, which was, now how do we get evidence and theory and data into what is predominantly, at the time, a dozen years ago, is predominantly like a UX or a user-centered design perspective. And that could be the good of it, which is we do a lot of user research and understand the problem and the needs and come at it from a qualitative perspective. But the pieces that we're missing that make a big difference, as you well know, is the evidence and the theory about, what are the mechanisms that we should be targeting? What are the behaviors? How do we know which behaviors? How do we understand the theoretical drivers and principles and behavior change techniques? And how do we translate all that into a user-centered design process, which could have many different variations of how user-centered that actually is. So for me, it was really about working with team members and cross-functional teams that were excellent at user experience and design, but without disrupting that design process, integrating all, theory and evidence and literature into that design process, to make better interventions that are used and engaging and things like that.
I want to pick up on something both of you have said, and I suspect there's elements of this too in Gitu's world, which is theory, and we start with a theory when we're designing an intervention, and it's the starting place. And I think one of the differences that I've noticed in working with folks who don't have a behavioral science and design background is those theories are a starting place for us that we grow from. And that's a little bit different maybe than in the financial world where, the revenue we collect minus our expenses is our profit. And that's a model that we operate for in finance. And we might have some missing data. But it's much more of an equation than what you might look at a behavioral theory and say, oh, it's an equation. I can take A plus B and I'm going to get outcome C, right? I'm going to take Kate, I'm going to put this button in front of her, and if she just clicks the button, I'm going to get my outcome. So would love to unpack with all of you a little bit, because I think it's a misunderstood element of what you all do, how you move from theory into your implementation and evaluation when you're doing behavioral science, because unfortunately people are not mice and we can't tightly control their environment. So we have to navigate through that. So, Claire, you talked about that and as one of your big learnings coming out of academia, where theory is a big part of your training. What has that looked like for you as you design, but then evaluate the limitations of the theory into implementation in the real world?
Yeah. Wow. It's a huge question. I think there's a couple different ways that tends to play out, in my role now. I think I tend to sort of think differently about, and I wish I need to come up with some better like jazzy branded language for this, but there's kind of there's the end-to-end, more clinical interventions that have a disease-specific focus that we still design in certain contexts, both at Headspace and at previous companies that I've been at. And in that context, we have not evolved as far from the more academic approach. But there's some very specific reasons for that. Typically, these are products that are either immediately or at some point going to be on a regulatory pathway, so going towards FDA clearance or approval, so that will be at some point a locked intervention, which then kind of removes some of that iterative testing, constant evolution, that might be in a more dynamic digital product. So for these more clinical end-to-end interventions that have typically, a prescribed number of weeks of intervention duration, they have a prescribed kind of sequence of mechanisms of change that may be able to be developed dynamically to some extent, but are more or less, kind of pre-mapped out. In those cases, the theory to intervention pathway is pretty short, right? We're doing some user-centered testing. We're thinking about how do we really bring best-in-class user experience, really digestible, engaging content delivery approaches. We don't want to create, for example, the example I always give my teams is, I don't want you to digitize a treatment protocol. I want us to think about how we create, compelling and digestible experiences that will still deliver these mechanisms. But more or less, we kind of know from the beginning, it's generally going to go this way. And it's generally going to follow this trajectory because we're on a much more locked pathway headed for FDA and approval. And, there's just simply more traditional expectations for how those interventions need to work. In a more consumer wellness, direct-to-consumer, non-regulated environment, I think that theory to intervention leap can look really different. And it's still really important, for the behavioral scientists on my team to get clear on, okay, what is the outcome that we are driving, whether that's stress reduction, might be more of a kind of wellness enhancement related outcome. But we want to be clear on first, what is that? What are the behaviors, the sets of behaviors that will influence that outcome? That's going to be our understanding of what those things are, will be driven by our understanding of theory and evidence in that space. But then it gets pretty loose, right? Because then we say, okay, generally we know that these are the mechanisms of change. These are the target behaviors. Then we take a really, I think of it as almost a micro approach. We think about those individual interactions with our product and think about how can we really test and iterate our way to an optimal experience, whether this is in a personalized app or maybe a more universal app. We really want to think about bringing those mechanisms of action to life in a way that suits this use case for, what type of member are we designing for? What do we know about their context and their psychology and their environment when arriving to this experience? And we want to really challenge ourselves to think about, oftentimes it's things like, how can we deliver this sooner, faster? How can we remove some of the other elements that get in the way of the mechanism of action? And then also allow, right, our designers, our content writers, our product managers to be part of that hypothesis generation brainstorming process as we start to then think about, well, let's test this way of doing the intervention in this more micro scale, right? Let's test this hypothesis that we have. And we allow ourselves a lot more, I think, flexibility in the way that we think about how do we bring what we know from traditional practice to life in this digital environment. Because we know that this can constantly evolve, right? And we can always be testing and always be improving in that non-regulated environment. And we want to do that in a way that's safe and effective and theory informed, but actually is possibly, going to lead us to new innovations and new understandings because we've allowed ourselves to approach that in a way that's a little bit, we're thinking of maybe a little more blue sky about that. So I think it can look really different, right? Depending which context we're operating in, but it's ultimately the same. It's just how, to some extent, how rigidly or how linearly is that applied?
Yeah. Gitu, I think there's a theory of what data you're going to collect and use, but of course, we all know in data science that missing data is always a challenge. So how do you navigate that theory of what you want to do versus the application as you design solutions and evaluate how well they're working?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think also going back to what Claire was saying, it really resonates, this idea that in the digital health space, we have this opportunity to sort of be more loosey-goosey, perhaps, about the way that we get to the end of where we're going. And that's I think from a clinical perspective and from maybe like the what the clinical disciplines have been steeped in has been a lot more like a pre-specification, and that's been important, and that has its place because we are operating in a space where the consequences are much more drastic. And so I think that's definitely something that's important to keep in mind. But I think like separating out this idea of like there's things that are on the path to regulatory for a regulatory track, and that perhaps should still stick to its own, the usual formulations that we have so far. But there is this whole space that we can explore today of things that are maybe not going to be regulated immediately, and that's where we should really be playing, right? And having all of our disciplines come together and really have more space for experimentation and iteration without having to pre-specify the entire path. And sometimes the theory can come post that, right? So like having data scientists and designers and product managers and engineers even just sit down and come up with ideas and having that free space in the beginning, I think has been really critical for us to sort of be able to find like new innovations and new ideas in terms of behavior change or workflows or optimizations, at least at Flatiron. And then and that's kind of, I think, one, and that's being one of the interesting things where, we've had, obviously we're trying to create these data sets, real world oncology data sets, and the data is super noisy, missing all the time. And so if you just were to take that and try to create your conventional trial, get the insights that you would from a conventional clinical trial, it would just not be very useful. But how can we sort of create this space to have that dialogue and openness, right? To sort of hypothesize, to have more space for hypothesis generation, essentially. And the idea being, I think where we've landed at Flatiron was that, along with some of our partners who we do this research with, it's been a journey of sort of like starting from where we wanted these perfect data sets to like sort of building an understanding that this data is not sort of the same, but it's complementary and really to be seen as additive. And really what you're trying to get out of this is directionality, right? And signal generation. And I find that in healthcare, that hasn't been necessarily the goal. I think we've always set ourselves the goal as like regulatory approval, or like this has to be perfect in all these ways. And I think just like lowering that bar and trying to say, how can I get signal for what my trial should look like? Or how can I get signal for what, what direction I should go in, is sort of, adopting that sort of hill climbing approach, I think is one of those lessons from computer science, which I think is very applicable in this space.
Yeah. Dustin, I want to make sure I give you a chance to chime in here as well.
I would say the one thing I would just add on, again, Claire, I'm loving your answers and your descriptions. I'm right in line. One of the things we've been working on over the past couple of years that we found to be really helpful is coming into the point of design when we start designing, right? After we've done our foundational research, after we all agreed on measurable outcomes, whose behaviors are changing in what way, what mechanisms we're going to target based on the research that we've done. What we like to do, or where the behavior change design team comes in to collaborate with the other disciplines, is we come in with a short list of behavior change techniques that have been We classify them as things that are found to be effective, right? The literature is growing using BCTs as an element in reporting for intervention. So where is there evidence for our problem, for our context? Do specific BCTs have been found to be effective? Looking at where they've been common, if you do market scans or look at other digital interventions that are similar, right, you can make some assumptions that if, self-monitoring is everywhere, maybe that's a good thing. And if it's also ineffective, great. And then also getting in the population perspective, right? What things do they think are helpful? Do they find helpful? Do they want to see? So breaking things down into this, common, effective, desirable in terms of behavior change techniques, letting the teams, and those teams could be, could include participants or co-designers, digest that information, and then doing collaborative design studios where we all get together, or we all remotely now, think about for a particular behavior where we're looking to change, where participants are saying, here's where I'm struggling, I'm having a hard time changing my diet, I'm having a hard time measuring my glucose, whatever it might be, right? Let's take those behavior change techniques and apply those in creative ways, right? As creatively as we can, into features, into content, into function. And that might differ depending on, how. If it's all participants, then maybe we want them to design the box or a magic button or a solution, and we backtrack and code it into, what techniques did we see in here, right? Because they're in there. You just got to tease them apart. But when it's teams that are more commonly designers, then it's really about how do we now come together, content person, interaction designer, strategist. How do we come together and apply a cluster of BCTs or things into a creative implementation, right? And that's where people bring, their experiences, their specific expertise, and often like the influences they see, right? When you look at commercial apps, or how do you think about self-monitoring in a way that's not self-monitoring in every health application, right? How do we do that in novel ways? How do we provide social support in ways that aren't the same way every health community is doing it, or things like that. And that's been a process that took us a while to get to, but has turned out to be really enjoyable to do and really useful in getting that front end of possibilities of design that are hopefully creative, innovative, and also grounded in the science and evidence that we've gathered in one way or another through the research phase.
Yeah, I enjoyed all of your answers, and one of the themes that I think I heard from each of you is this using the science as a place to start from. And what I used to refer to that in my consulting work is I was like, I do Bayesian product development. I take the science as a known prior, and we use that to seed where we're going forward. And I heard that from each of you. And I think as scientists, we love the science. That's why we start there. But we also want to see it grow. So how do each of you think about how far you can grow from the science before you risk snake oil territory, where you're out over your skis and making claims beyond the science about what your product can do? And let any of you jump in who wants to tackle that meaty topic.
I'm happy to comment from my perspective. I mean, again, like huge issue in the field that is worth like its own panel to discuss. But I think in a nutshell, I think it's really important to stay engaged in both pieces of that equation. So yes, we are innovating, we're being creative, we're thinking about how do we bring these BCTs into a digital experience, relying on science to kind of help us set that path, but also then evaluate, right? And evaluate in both real world, but also traditional settings, right? And there's, I think, different fit for purpose for different types of research design and research methodology. And I'm not sort of it must be RCT for all things at all times, but it is, I think I've been surprised how often that piece of the equation falls by the wayside in digital health, right? Where we say, well, we have a cognitive behaviorally informed intervention. Here it is, and it's going to do all these things because we know from the literature that cognitive behavior therapy or behaviorism as a theory drives these outcomes, and thus our product also does. And that to me is where we start to get into snake oil territory, which really is more about holding ourselves accountable to then evaluate those interventions that we create and evaluate them using whatever method is fit for the claim that we wish to make, right? And that's going to look differently in a direct-to-consumer wellness environment than it does in a regulated space, certainly, and even in certain types of marketing versus others. But I think just embracing that there are different levels of evidence required for those different contexts, and then saying we will do the work to evaluate these innovations that we've created and ensure that we're saying something accurate about them. If I had to put it in a tiny nutshell, I would say that that's how I think about it. And as an industry, we're still very much figuring out how to implement like a system across the board for having that level of evaluation and evidence.
And I would add to that too. I think so we're consultants, and one of the values that we can bring or we can add to clients that already have products in market or near to market, we often see they may have some level of evidence in there. They may have had some evidence-based process that was in there, but people don't always have a mapping of how they think the intervention is supposed to work. What is that causal chain, backwards from outcome to behavior to mechanism to behavior change technique to features, functions, content, so on and so forth. So there's two pieces I think there that helps. One is I think process evaluations are awesome. If you can, as a creator of digital health products, or team up with researchers or partners to build that map and that chain, so we understand what the intervention is, hypothesized to do. I think is a really powerful step. So everyone on a team understands how it works and what it's supposed to be doing, and all the functions and purpose of content and interactions. And then when you get to an evaluation stage, and I hope that it is more often and more common and sooner than not, I think that what we're seeing is there's often, if you're talking RCT, there's probably a huge lift to get that off the ground. But whatever the evaluation is, adding a process evaluation doesn't seem to be the same magnitude of lift with a client, for us anyway, in adding that process eval to other kinds of outcomes or efficacy evaluations. And that really one helps with shaping claims, refining claims, and then of course optimizing and updating your application based on what you find, not only in outcomes but within process as well.
Yeah, just to add to what Dustin and Claire were saying, this actually reminds me, before I started in healthcare, I was working for a decade or so in media. And so I helped build a lot of personalized news engines, moved fast, broke a lot of things, all of that. And then, and so for me, working in healthcare is always kind of this interesting sort of look at now trying to use, all of those techniques around engagement and creating engaging digital products, right? In the media space, we are taking those techniques and now trying to apply them in healthcare, but hopefully moving fast, right? Taking that iterative mindset, but keeping in mind that the outcome here is much, much, much more important than any click-through rate on on your digital website, or echo chamber or whatever you can create. And so I think going back to what Dustin was saying, I think having the outcome and the measurement and evaluation in mind, right, and being really, really thoughtful about what those outcomes are, and not just relying on, especially at least when I look at oncology, and even in neurology, there's just so much of an emphasis these days on surrogate endpoints and taking shortcuts that, being cognizant of what is it that we are trying to achieve, right? And really measuring the outcome you want and holding yourself accountable to that, I think is something that we as a field really need to sort of hold the line on and value.
Yeah. I think one of the things that has come through in each of your comments is there's not a single outcome necessarily that we're designing for when we do this work. And Claire, you alluded to a different business model context, right? If it's direct to consumer versus employer. Obviously in the oncology space and many others, we have both the patient and the provider who might have different outcomes that they are looking for. And the phrase I've always turned to is one that Margaret Laws from the Hope Lab taught me, which is use, choose, and do's. So someone has to use this, which for us is often the patient. Someone's going to choose it, which might be a provider recommending a solution, and someone's going to pay the dues on it, which might be an employer or a payer system. And in, consumer goods, those are often all the same person. But in healthcare, we get the super fun bonus challenge of often serving 3 different customers who may be looking for 3 different outcomes. And so each of you have had to navigate settings where you have different users that you're designing for and different outcomes they're looking for. And that presents a set of challenges for how you land on your solution. So recognizing that you can't necessarily air all the dirty laundry, but would love if one of you or multiple of you are willing to talk through an example of how you've navigated that in the past.
Well, so I hope it's detailed enough, but I think again for us, there's a couple levels. There's the let's help the clients focus on outcomes, period, right? Starting there, because there may not be alignment across all the different stakeholders and stakeholder groups that we're working with. They all may have outcomes that they're driving toward. One group might be engagement and utilization, another might be cost reduction, but there's no linkages between the two, even though they're probably clearly very linked. Another one might have health outcomes. They might not even have health outcomes. And then maybe somewhere, plus or minus, we might have patient-reported outcomes or some kind of patient, important outcomes, we'll say. What do the patients want to see, and how are we getting their wants and needs within there, because that's also good for everybody. So when we work with different organizations, that step one is really where are we in terms of what are, is there alignment? Do we have outcomes in mind? Do you all agree on what those are? Do we expand, contract, make those in one way or another? And then it seems to be two things. It usually goes in 2 directions. It is when they may be cost and things like that aren't typically the most important things up front in the work we do. They're there. We may have some guidance. We may work a little bit on that, but we really end up working on, the health outcomes, the clinical outcomes, or the patient, we'll say again, patient-reported type of outcomes. So for us, it's about when the clients are very focused on these are the things the patients want to achieve. We've done a lot of qualitative research and we've talked to patients. we go, yes, that is great. But if you are truly looking to improve some sort of biomarkers or some physiological or mental health, and you're staking a claim on that, we need to make sure we're changing X, Y, and Z behaviors that maybe you haven't thought about yet, or you're not sure if we're changing, so that we are all much more confident we're changing those health behaviors that will then lead to the outcomes. It's awesome that patients want to compare their rheumatoid arthritis to the weather. But at this point in time, there's no good evidence that says these two things are really, really related, right? And you might have a symptom, but it's not affecting the behaviors that are going to really make the biggest impact on the health outcomes, right? We'll keep that in there because that will help engagement and things like that. So for us, we really try to see where folks are at, kind of wedge ourselves in the middle of, business, clinical outcomes, patient outcomes, and then be the advocate for whichever side seems to be lagging a bit, right? And where we can make that influence. So if we're focused a lot on patient, but there's not a lot of good health evidence or clinical protocols in there, for example, or even the right target behaviors, that's really where we start to push. If it's very clinical based, and it's often when it is, it may be a very burdensome intervention, right? Where it's a lot of work and a lot of self-management and opening the app 100 times a day. We start to try to find the things that, or there's gaps, patients just aren't using it. We try to find those spots and things that the patients find to be important and wanted, and make the case for how those bits can be covered and designed into what may be a very good, clinical, technical application. Give it that person-centered focus and improve that experience from the user side. So finding that sort of fulcrum point and getting in and pushing left or right usually is where we find ourselves. And back it all up with data as best we can.
Yeah, I really like Dustin. That's a much more thoughtful framework of how to look at this. Then I feel like my initial response to Kate's question was really, it feels like healthcare is sort of set up almost to have these misaligned incentives, and really all you can do is just there are like these few niche areas where you can kind of like identify, as you were saying, these spots where you can kind of push and somehow align incentives. But usually it's always incremental change, right? And for the really big innovations, I feel like it just takes longer, and we really have to like. I think the difference is also like it's never a single thing. Like it's not like a tech change or a clinical change. It's always like having all of those systems incentives aligned, right? So if you were trying to make an intervention, it's you have to make sure that your digital technology is working in that way, but then also have a surrounding sort of supportive care services, etc. around, and that's really only possible, I think, in certain scenarios. But I think that's also like the fun of, as Kate was saying, the fun and the challenge of working in healthcare.
So you mean we're not just going to take some device and it's not just going to magically solve all of our human behavior problems?
No.
I think a whole lot of startups aren't going to like hearing that, Gitu, but a whole
I
lot of behavioral scientists are going to be really relieved that someone said it.
Yeah, I was just going to point out though that I find that I am actually hopeful that there are some startups that are able to, like, when you start thinking from scratch, right, then you have a little more space to sort of like design, reimagine the approach. And so I'm a little bit, I am hopeful about some of these like wraparound care startups that are sort of targeting small problems. And I'm less hopeful when I look at these bigger organizations, because those just like the systems are going to take years to change. Not to end on that often overly pessimistic note, but it's healthcare. So.
No, it kind of comes back to where Claire started us, right? That the goal to her team and the challenge is not to digitize what exists, but to reimagine how we can leverage the opportunity in front of us to do it really differently and better.
Absolutely. And collect the data and the evidence, right, to show we really are doing it better in a way that matters and isn't just jazzier.
I think that there is an interesting tension there, and Dustin, you kind of alluded to it in your remarks, that we might include things in an intervention that we don't think are going to drive the clinical outcome, but they might be the jazziness that keeps someone engaged or gets them to initiate the program, but it's not going to design for clinical outcomes. And I think maybe, Claire, this was a little bit implied in what was missing in our academic training, is that part isn't always thought about. And so I'd love, each of you to kind of talk about how you track the things that you are doing in an intervention that are engagement, initiation, maybe just marketing, right? That they have some sex appeal to them, and they're important, but they're not going to drive a clinical outcome, and how you balance those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think that there is actually a great analogy here to clinical practice, at least in the mental health space, which is there's always been a chasm between research and implementation in the community. And when we look at how treatments work in research, of course, they are beautiful, elegant, step by step, 8 weeks of intensive XYZ to drive outcomes. And they always work, the efficacy findings of those studies are enormous. Then you look at how those are implemented in the community, and setting aside, of course, one of the big issues in mental health, which is that we don't see a lot of evidence-based practice in the community. Sometimes we do, but of course it's going to come to life differently. And the elements that clinicians are bringing into their work in order to make evidence-based practice more resonant, more accessible, more approachable for communities, we can really learn a lot from. And we're kind of doing the same dance, right? So I think of, I worked at the VA for years, and in one of our veterans recovery centers, we're working with veterans who have serious mental illness, and they spend a lot of time each day at the center. And so we're not, we're providing evidence-based treatments. We're also providing like snacks and tea and couches where we kind of hang out and chat, and you're not always interacting with a psychologist. There's, the veterans are also just getting to know each other, spending time together. Those aren't discrete elements that you would be able to point to in a treatment protocol to say, this is, for example, I led groups on acceptance and commitment therapy for people with psychotic disorders. Those aren't elements of that treatment protocol. They're not related to that, but no one's going to come to my group or even trust me enough to try that group if we don't also have this really approachable, lovely living room type of space that you could just hang out at and not come to the group. And maybe after a few weeks, you decide to try it, right? So we see this in the community already. And we've seen clinicians who want to reach the populations that they work with really think in that way, to say, this isn't about what works on paper. This is about what connects with the people that I'm trying to reach. And how do I sort of try different things and get to know their context in a way that makes that more relevant. We do have the same opportunity in digital health, and I think it would be great for us to think of it that way, right? Which is not necessarily thinking about it in terms of how do I drive up my engagement metrics for my VC-backed consumer wellness company. It's how do I create conditions that make this intervention to improve someone's health or well-being attractive to them, approachable, accessible, relevant to their lives. And that will have the positive byproduct of driving up engagement metrics for your consumer wellness company. But I think we really need to think about it, at at least for, the behavioral scientists and the designers and the ones who are really close to the product, like to embrace that that's our mission, to really do that translation from research into practice and think about making these experiences really accessible and approachable. And that means not everything that we pack into an app is, like in my world, this is CBT and this is a discrete intervention, right? Maybe it's also like really beautiful when you open it, or there's some game element that isn't really about driving outcome. It's more about having a positive experience with this product and feeling like I can do this. This is something that I could actually see incorporating into my life. We see that a lot in with meditation at Headspace, that there's a hump we want to get over of that inaccessibility of feeling like I can't meditate for 45 minutes a day, or I don't know how to meditate, I'm not good at it. So we want to incorporate elements in the experience that are about, here's a really easy to follow animation that's going to guide you through some breathing. You were just mindful of your breath. You did it. Like, this is something that you can do. There is some active ingredient in there, but we include things like just sort of fun videos that are peaceful and calming, that aren't necessarily meant to drive outcome, but they are meant to create a sense that this is a product that can be that you can use. It's approachable and accessible for you. And of course, we have like a ton of work to do there too, but generally I try to think about it in that way.
I love that, and it's a great note to close on, I think, Claire, because you're talking about designing a great experience, and part of designing an effective behavior change program is designing the great experience. And of course, I love that you talked about the importance of having snacks at a meeting, and I think it's one of the things we all miss from our in-person meetings is the ability to gather over the coffee hour snacks and really get to know each other. And have those follow-up conversations. So I will miss having that opportunity with all of you, and hope that we get to do it at a future conference together. This was a lovely conversation, and really enjoyed the perspective that all of you brought to it. So thank you very much for your time and your contributions to the conversation.
Thank you, everyone. That was great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.